Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here, providing some background context information for this week's material on a perspective called the Matrix of Domination and its connection to understanding the social construction of race. If you have any questions about this material, or you want to engage further, or you want more resources, let me know. There's a lot of valuable resources out there to investigate, understand, unpack origins of biological notions of race and its transformation throughout time. So it's an important topic area. It's super fascinating and important as well. So drop a message if you do have any questions or want some more sources of information. And again, I think it's important to start off and thinking about. We talked, I think it was last week, the social construction, the idea of social construction, the meaning that we give things meaning within a particular time period, cultural context. Nothing has any inherent meaning. Gender doesn't mean anything in particular. The ideas of gender are influenced by history, time period, social location, social class. I mean, a lot of different factors, right? Humans are giving meaning towards gender and sexuality and race. They don't have any inherent meaning in them, so they're arbitrary, but yet very real. Because within a society, things can be defined in particular ways to the point where it gets taken for granted. It's assumed that this is the way things are, when the reality is that the meaning that's given to something maybe it's arbitrary, it's subjective, and sometimes it's forgotten and it's viewed as being truth. And this is, important to be able to understand. Like we've gone through this process where we can look back now and say, okay, starting in the 1700s, this idea of biological races emerged. Ideas of biological race did not exist prior to the 1700s, and this is in Western societies. If you go back to like ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, other communities, other city states, ideas of what we call ethnic groups existed. People saw difference and recognized difference between different groups, but it wasn't defined as a biological race. Like there's a genetic foundation to race. That's a very much a byproduct of the development and expansion of science and the Enlightenment in 1700s. So while biological ideas of races were viewed as reality, like for probably since let's say the mid 1700s, late 1700s until late 1900s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, biological ideas of race were viewed as being true and being real. So even though they were being viewed as being real, that there was this idea that biological races existed, we recognize today that this was purely construction. That there was a belief in the biological view. There was a lot of energy put into the biological view there's consequences to that. The recognition today among most institutions is that there is no biological basis for race. So while biological races do not exist, they are consequential because cultures and institutions respond to things or meanings come out of culture that are reinforcing ideas about race. Institutions are not race neutral, that there are different impacts on different groups and by institutions along racial lines. So it's the perceived difference, it's a cultural difference. It's not based on biology, but rather, even though it's subjective, it's very real because we define it that way. So another way of thinking about that is that even though ideas of race are arbitrary, we still see it. We still see race. So this is why color blindness is problematic. This idea that I don't see color, I just see people, it's problematic because we still live in a culture that reinforces ideas about race. So we're going to develop those ideas of race. We're going to bring those ideas into institutions. They may influence hiring practices, the way institutions operate. So there's a reality that can't be denied, but remember that there is no biological basis for race. So this leads us to like the Thomas theorem. If you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. This is a central sociological perspective about the importance of understanding meaning, is that it doesn't matter if the meaning is true or not. What matters is if we define it that way. If we define something to be true, then there's reality, it's real in its consequences. So social construction of reality, I kind of already went through this a little bit, but I'll just kind of highlight a little bit more. So it comes out of the work of Berger and Luckman, Social Construction of Reality in 1966. Constructs are human creations, or they're not real. Constructs, categories, meaning that we give things. Why pink and blue are associated with male and female, that's totally arbitrary, cultural. The meaning that we give body height and whether short, tall, associated with gender. I mean, these are all arbitrary kind of things. And we view the world through constructs. We get socialized into them through culture and society, and then we view the world through those particular constructs. Sometimes constructs get very stable. They get embedded in institutions. We develop a lot of shared meaning about them. In a lot of ways, biological races operated that way for 200 in some years, right? They were very stable. This idea that people believed that biological races existed. Institutions developed policies and laws based on ideas of biological race. And so there's this agreed upon meaning, even though it wasn't objective and real. It's influenced by and shaped by the language and habits of the community. So, the way we construct reality is by shaping language. We develop a language system. Racial categories are language systems. The word or the racial categories of, Hispanic versus Latinx. These are categories and these are human creations. What ethnic groups fit underneath the category of Hispanic? Looking back in U.S. Census history, where do these racial categories come from? When did racial categories get integrated into the U.S. Census? How do they move and change across time? This is all about a reflection of language. And then meaning gets instituted, becomes reality. It's arbitrary but very real. And as mentioned before, at the Thomas theorem, what matters is if we define it that way, then it's real in its consequences. So I'll give you some illustrations. There's one, a fabulous book, I think. There's some podcasts with Isabel Wilkerson. There's actually, I think, a film that came out last year, maybe the year before, based on her work, Cast the Origin of Discontents. And her argument and perspective is that we live in a caste-based system, caste where we have strict hierarchy and very difficult to cross the lines in terms of race going up and down the hierarchy. And it's not only race, but it's, she says it's caste. There's something larger than race. It's class. There's other dimensions to this. And she was talking about, in one of her talks, she mentions that she was going over giving a lecture on her book. Someone came up to her afterwards and said, "Hey, there are no black people in Africa. Africans are not black. They are different ethnic groups. They're seen that way in Africa, but they are not black. They become black when they immigrate to the United States or migrate to the United States." So that language, right? So there are no black people in Africa because that category of race doesn't exist in that particular culture, in that particular environment. The U.S. Census Bureau recognizes that racial categories, this is the language from the U.S. Census, they included in the census questionnaire reflect a social definition of race recognized in this country and do not attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. And that's a fairly recent statement by the U.S. Census, so very much directly communicating that these are categories that are human creations. They are not meant to define things biologically. If you're interested, Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man, and Nell Irving Painter, The History of White People, the second book here, is a really thorough investigation to racial categorization and histories of whiteness and ideas about biological categories. Super valuable, important if you're interested. Prior to the Enlightenment, racial categories did not exist, as I mentioned. So it was in the 1700s. There's other factors, religion, language, ethnic groups, different status markers. But it wasn't ideas of biological race. Somewhere in that time period, 1700s, 1800s, there became a move towards biological scientific conceptions of race. Now, At that same time period, what's going on is exploration, colonization from Western European countries, conquering and colonizing other nations. So I think you could kind of start to make a connection that these biological notions of race serve a purpose for colonizing because it can justify the subjugation of a group of people, creating a hierarchy, who's at the top of the hierarchy, who's less human. So it allows for a justification, an ideological justification for the subjugation of a group of people. Um, so something to consider there. Here's just to kind of illustrate the power of what, these conceptions of race. And we recognize today these are pseudoscience. I mean, there was the belief that this was scientists at its pure level doing this sort of really objective work. But we look at this today, these depictions, and we can see the scientific racism that's going on within there, other areas of inequality and scientific classism. We have one in the picture on the right there, this hierarchy, this evolutionary perspective where the Greco-Roman bust is, that sort of that Aryan sort of features and depiction, that particular race is the superior race. These are scientists reinforcing these inequities through their categorization of race, and this evolutionary perspective of who's more um, associated with the primates versus who's evolved more as a human species. I mean, this is today we recognize this is pseudoscience, scientific racism. But again, during that time period when this was at its, from the 17, 18, 19 until the 1950s, 60s, 70s, these were commonly accepted notions of race. Another way of kind of recognizing, or some different examples in the United States, we have what's called the one drop rule. That an individual who has of African descent, of any African descent, gets the master status of being black, being African American, and it's very much in the United States. And this is the United States, and every culture is going to have its own ways of thinking about race, racial categories, perceptions of race. And with the long history of slavery in the United States, racial oppression in the United States, that through the legal system and other mechanisms, that these ideas become real differently expressed in the United States in our own history than in another place. We had these for a while in the United States, these different racial categories to signify a person's lineage, genetic history, and their percentage of African descent within their personal lineage or genetics or family lineage. So mulatto is someone of mixed race. Quadroon is somebody who's one-fourth of African descent. Octoroon, one-eighth. I mean, these are categories that were being promoted and put out there. Like, why? It's pretty arbitrary making these distinctions, and they reflect what's going on, give us a sense of what's going on in that particular time period. And I think this one, provides a really powerful example. This is a case of Susie Gilroy Phipps. If you're interested, you could look up more information about her, but she applied for, I think she went to go apply for a visa or passport. She wanted to travel to a different country. She identified as white. She always thought that was her family orientation, or family racial designation. She went to go get her birth certificate. On her birth certificate, it said colored was the language the state used at that particular point in time. And look at genealogically, she's 132nd of African descent, and she was not. She was identified as being colored. This is the idea of the one drop rule. Like that's really arbitrary. 132nd. There's no biological basis for that. That's a social convention. Yeah, and you can think about identification of different racial, different groups, right? Arab Americans, Asian, Korean, Vietnamese, Japan, Chinese, different time periods in American history, different ways of thinking about race based on the historical events that are going on. Central America, South America. I mean, these meanings are movable and changeable, right? They're socially constructed. Um, and a transition from non-white to white. Um, can't remember why I put that in there, to tell you the truth. Okay. So then we can get into all kinds of different things like, okay, so man, context matters, different meaning. The great migration of African Americans migrating out of the South to move towards the northern cities where there's different job opportunities, economic opportunities, war industries, opportunities in manufacturing, and to escape some of the oppressive forces in the South. There are still problems in the North for sure. But now it's sort of going to be challenging. Some of these different ideas about race are going to start to move and change. Civil rights movement, 1950s, 1960s, challenging different conceptions of race. Brown versus Board of Education, which ended legal segregation in the United States. So again, it's going to challenge this idea that racial categories, as stated, as believed at that time, are objective, and that these racial categories, there's recognition that these racial categories are not only subjective, but they're problematic and detrimental to the welfare of people in society. There was a concern for passing, this idea of passing in the 1940s, 1950s, an idea that a person who appears white could pass as a person who appears white, but actually has African, as part of their genealogy is from Africa, that they could pass as white. And what are the complications potentially for that? This is something I think we could look at to say, man, this is something that was very particular to that time period. This is the second wave of the Great Migration. Brown versus Board of Education. There's fear among segments of the white community about what could happen if a person could pass as white and their son or daughter developed a romantic relationship and got married to this person. Would they have, what would their baby be? Would their baby be a person of color? Would their baby be white? And there was a sort of fear that was going on about the mixing of the races back in the 1950s. I mean, think about how different the conversation is today. And just illustrate and underscore the reality that race is a social construct. It's arbitrary, but yet it's very real because that's how it was defined during that time period. If we looked at scientific racism in that chart previously, we see it again here. This is not from an academic journal article or a book. This is from we call think tank, the Carnegie Institute. And it's both race and class issues going on here. This idea, this white person, a person who, this female who is black, they have to get married, they have kids. That this person can pass as white. Two white people, there's a social class factor going on here, right? This is like the more middle upper class. They have four kids. This person is white. They have a baby, and the baby is a white baby. They're trying to alleviate the public's concerns. This is not biology. This is totally based on cultural notions at that particular time period and based on fear. So let's make a connection to the matrix of domination. So the matrix draws attention to the intersection of race, gender, and other parts of our identities, social class, for example, so that we see it intersectionally. Seeks to understand the relationship between the oppressor, and let's not think about the oppressor in terms of individual, but think about oppressor as a collective, as a group, as more than just the sum of individuals. It's a class, it's a segment of the population. Between the oppressor and the oppressed, between the oppressed and between the oppressor or those who are the dominators to those who are oppressed. There's a relationship between the two. So, impossible to have privilege without domination. There's a relationship between the two. So the goal from like Patricia Hill Collins is the empowerment and movement towards actualizing liberal ideas, not political party liberal, but liberal ideas in terms of freedom, democracy, individual opportunity, all these different things that we associated values of a democratic society to help ensure that that these ideas of equality, ideas of justice, these ideas of individual opportunity are put into place, and that we need to examine relationships between domination and subjugation in order to move closer to that. So scientific knowledge limits, provides, scientific knowledge is valuable, it's important, but also can be very limiting for social change and social reform because it's one way of knowing, but it's not the only way of knowing. And if we don't have more complete ways of knowing, we're going to miss an opportunity to be able to understand things more completely. And I'll give you some different examples of that. So Patricia Hill Collins argues or provides a perspective that scientific knowledge, empirical knowledge, it's a powerful way of knowing, and it's a way of knowing that's supported by a system of inequity, that's supported by the support that supports the relationship between domination and subjugation. And how that does so is that it's through the data and not hearing the stories. For example, it's the empirical, and the empirical alone doesn't provide us an opportunity to ask questions about things about in a more objective way about kind of equal rights and justice and people's perspectives, the lived experience of people. It moves us into data, which is valuable and important. It's one way of knowing, but it's not the only way of knowing. So look at, for example, like history of indigenous people in the United States, the movement west, policies by the US government that influence the subjugation of Native peoples in the United States. Now, data can be important to understand that, but what's going to be maybe more motivating for a population is people understand the stories, the background, the history of different groups of people who are impacted by these policies. That's going to be more, perhaps more powerful to as a vehicle to understand and to promote greater equity if we understand these stories. And so, what Hill Collins is arguing for is that we need to be able to maybe understand things at an empirical level sometimes, but we have to have other ways of knowing as well. And these other ways of knowing that gets us into the more interpretive realm and the more subjective, meaning personal experience, that becomes important to develop a more complete way of knowing. So if we privilege the empirical and neglect the interpretive, that potentially reinforces a system of power and domination. Here's one example I've used before in some of my classes that if you look at homicide rates per 100,000 people in Chicago from 91 to 2021, we see racial distribution. Well, this is like data, right? It's empirical. It's reported by the Uniform Crime Statistics or Uniform Crime Reports, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and we get this data. It's data. Data. Okay, let's unpack this for a moment. What about the influence of social class? Why are we identifying it by racial lines and not also about educational level and social class? So there's a bias that's built into this data that's not recognized. Also, that when we do this, we have these distinctions, white, Latino, black here that it potentially reinforces an idea that this is a racial problem versus a problem of, institutions within certain communities, history, culture, other aspects of things that are going on. And it's beyond, it's not placed within sort of a racial group. It's social. It's go back to sociological imagination. There's social forces that are operating. It's not a racial group that's the influence here. It's the experience of different groups of people. Like that's what becomes important. So the matrix of domination. So we differentiate between rationalism and empiricism. Empiricism meaning the data, rationalism meaning thinking about things like critical thinking, examination, hearing different groups, stories, experiences, getting into the interpretive framework, reading literature, having conversations with people with different backgrounds and different experiences. That leads to more objective levels of understanding and more humanization by engaging in those interpretive things. Subjective is an important source of information that's sometimes devalued in our culture. And Patricia Hill Collins raises the question, like, why is that devalued? And part of the argument is we devalue those personal stories because by bringing in if we brought in those personal stories, the world gets more complex and it could disrupt that system of domination and privilege and domination in society. So there's interest to be protected by distancing ourselves from understanding the journeys and life experiences of people of different racial, ethnic, class, et cetera, groups. So there's degrees of value neutrality. All knowledge has value positions. Rational approaches have value positions. Empirical have value positions. It's important that we understand those. And she also argues or provides a perspective that we engage in dialogue about topics and not debate. It's not about winning. a particular viewpoint. It's about offering perspectives, ideas, critical thinking, evaluation, and engaging in discussion. So understanding the lived experience of different groups requires dialogue to be able to understand different perspectives, uh, come about public discourse so we can better understand collectively through the collective understanding of different groups, different experiences, we achieve a better level of understanding. And that's about rationalism. So interpretive not weighted more than empirical. The subjective and the objective are both important ways of knowing. Um, it's important to address the unique experiences and the commonalities across different groups. Intellectuals, biologists, social scientists value the empirical, but also can be what's called praxis-oriented researchers, where praxis meaning using research to promote social change. Like that can be is really important. That all science has values that are embedded in it. Humans are value-centered individuals. It's important that we understand how values enter our work, but also to use our values in ways or to integrate our values into our work to promote social change. Like that's okay. All knowledge is generated. So recognizing who's generating the knowledge. To go back to biological conceptions of race, okay, who's generating that knowledge? Who's supporting that knowledge generation? How do we understand the different groups and different experiences when we come to ideas about constructing ideas about the social world? Kelsey Freeman's book, No Option But North, pretty powerful book about understanding the experience of individuals from Central America migrating north. It includes both the empirical in her work, the empirical data about number of individuals migrating, the empirical level about that experience, but then also the lived experiences of different people in different communities and migration. And so it's to me, it's like this interesting interplay between we can have both the empirical and the rational, and they can both be beneficial. So addresses the organization of power relations. So Hill Collins is interested in how is like these inequities and the issue of power, privilege, and domination, how is it organized within society itself? And um, it's addressing different parts of our identities, looking at things in different ways. Jason Sokal's work, There Goes My Everything, White Southerners in the Age of Civil Rights. Sokal's trying to understand like what's going on during the time period 1940s, 1950s, 60s, the March for Greater Racial Equality. How are whites in the South experiencing that particular change? And trying to engage in rationalism, not about data, right? It's like, okay, what is the experience of whites in the South during that time period? Coming at it from a place of empathy and understanding, not trying to demonize or marginalize whites in the South, but understand what was their perspective? How were they thinking about this particular social change? What was their response? And it's through that dialogue and engagement that we can better understand human behavior, the human experience, and the relationship between privilege and domination, for example. There's four domains of power. There's the structural, things like laws and policies. There's the disciplinary, which is basically the administration of the structure. So it's the administration, the management of these different systems. Then we get into the interpersonal, which is our individual experience about privilege and domination, and the hegemonic, the overall ideological beliefs within society itself. So Brown versus Board of Education, that's a law. Go back to 1896 and Plessy versus Ferguson, which started legal segregation. That's a law, right? So then we get the disciplinary structure, which those who are enforce the law, administer the law. That's another level of the structure. Or another level of the matrix of domination. Then we get into the subjective individual experience, how people experience privilege and or domination. And then society can maintain inequality through influencing the dominant beliefs within society itself. So hegemony is super powerful. If we believe in this idea that everybody can make it to the top in terms of economics, we're minimizing the role that social structure plays and whose interests are served by that. That becomes something to look at. And then the matrix of domination is how do these four different sectors, the structured, the disciplinary, interpersonal, hegemonic, that these all factor into maintaining a system of inequality, inequality meaning a system of privilege and domination. So for this week, there's a video on social construction of realities, which I think will help. There's also a podcast that goes through Patricia Hill Collins's work. I provide probably more like academic discussion about Patricia Hill Collins' work than you're going to get from the podcast. But the podcast is super accessible and I think fairly easy to get into and understand like where she's coming from and how to understand the matrix of domination. And there's also a chapter from a book of hers that goes through the matrix of domination. It may be more technical, a little bit more difficult to read, but I think if you're interested, it can be really valuable because it gives you more information about the matrix model, this distinction between rationalism and empiricism, which is really important as well. And this will come up in a couple weeks when we talk more about a particular, some different examples of the importance and value of rationalism. Who were the scientists, for example, in talking about sexuality and gender? How is it that, like if you have male scientists are predominantly male, what kind of questions are they asking about sexuality and gender might differ, might if women were, once the women become more women become scientists, become involved in biology and biological research, different questions are going to be asked. So we start to encourage the development of rationalism about how our identities can influence even in the research process, what questions are asked, how things are investigated, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's an overview. Hope you have a great day, great week, and yeah, take care.